This is the Elgato 4KX capture card. First in the Elgato line for 4K 144 capture and pass-through via USB-C. Now, there's a lot to unpack about this, so I'm going to be making a series of videos to talk about this and its different use case scenarios. But the first one I want to start with is with an iPad. You're probably asking, why with an iPad? So with the release of this card, Elgato has been really pushing the iPad's capture app that they created in order to capture gameplay on the go or even use the iPad as your primary workhorse. And it says it not only work with this one, it could work with a HD60X, but also it could work with the HD60S. These are a lot of capture cards that can be used, but which one is right for you?
I'm so confused.
So before you go spending all your money on the brand new capture card, which it's amazing, trust me, like it's great, but let's talk about the limitations, especially if you're using this with an iPad. If you're considering using the iPad as your primary capture device, or even as a secondary capture device, each card is going to run slightly under what it's capable of. However, there are still some benefit features that you're going to want to consider, maybe the upgrade or the higher end card for your setup. So a couple things that you need to understand when you're using these different capture cards is just what they're capable of. And I think for starters, when you're talking about the new 4KX, this is going to be a must-have for any new gen console player, only because of the pass-through alone. You get 4K 144 Hz max pass-through, and most of these systems like the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, it's going to max out at 4K 120. Now, if you are like me and you have a TV or monitor that's capable of hitting that limit, then you want to make sure you're picking up this card. But if you don't have a 4K 120 or 144 or anything in that range, this capture card is probably not going to be useful for you.
Then what do we do?
To better understand which card is right for you, we're going to talk about the three scenarios, depending on what console you're playing, how you want to capture, what you're actually playing on, that's going to be best for your situation. Now, I will leave the timestamps for each configuration in the description below, so that way you could go ahead and watch whichever one works best for you. But I would appreciate if you watched it all, because, you know, it does help the algorithm. I mean, we're homies, right? You're going to hook me up.
Are we friends?
So the first question we want to ask is, what is your primary viewing device? Like, where do you hook up your systems to? Is it a monitor? Is it a TV? And what's it capable of? That's really going to decipher what you're looking for. So if you're playing on a 4K TV with native 120 refresh rate or a monitor with over 120 Hertz, then definitely you're going to be looking at the higher end cards versus the lower end options. But if you're playing on like a 1080p monitor, then you're most likely going to want to go for the lower end cards. Or the second question is, just because you have a high power TV or with the newer technology, what console are you playing? What console are you going to primarily be streaming, capturing? Do you have any desires later on to play on the next gen consoles or even the current gen consoles? So like, let's talk about case one. You play on a 4K monitor that can do 120 native, and you also are playing on one of the next gen consoles or current gen consoles like the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X or S. That's when the 4KX is going to be what you want. And like I said, on the iPad, even though it's going to capture slightly lower than what it's capable of, the pass-through is really what you're looking for. If you're like me and you want to get the most out of your game, you do not want to sacrifice your quality of what you're playing for or even the refresh rate. Because as we know, higher FPS makes you better at gaming. More. So like, if you're like me, I have an Xbox Series X, I have an LG C1, which is a 4K 120 native TV. This is my perfect setup and with using this, because it allows me to not only get the full resolution and experience from my console, but I can capture all that gameplay and not have to worry about limitations of the card. When it comes to the iPad though, this card is going to have a cap on the capture app of 4K 60 frames per second. And that cap doesn't matter what app you're using, whether you're using Elgato's capture app to record your gameplay or a streaming app like Camo Studio, you're going to be limited to a max of 4K 60 frames per second, which it doesn't affect necessarily your pass-through, because that's a nice thing about these cards. You can have your pass-through go at your full spec sheet, but the capture can be at that lower resolution or at that lower frames per second. One of the things about Apple that Elgato even talks about on their website, you can't control the bitrate. There's no way to natively control what bitrate you are going to be recording or streaming on right now. That's definitely, if you want the highest of qualities you're able to achieve, definitely go with the 4K-X. So let's talk about the 60X. Now the 60X is still a great capture card, especially for current gens. Now, maybe you don't have the latest TV or the latest monitor. You're still rocking maybe a 2K monitor or even a 1080p that could go up to 140, 240, whatever the case, right? The HD60X is still a great capture card. Because you're already not seeing the highest specs of your current consoles, doesn't mean you can't get a lot of benefits out there. Pass-through goes up to 4K 60 frames per second, or 2K at 140 frames per second. So you still get a really good pass-through rate. So your gameplay and quality is not affected, especially if you're already used to that with your monitor or your TV. So the max you can capture on the iPad, whichever app you're using, is going to be 4K 30. That's the limit. You can do 1080 60, but if you want 60 frames per second at 4K resolution, this is definitely going to be a limitation for you. However, you still get that great pass-through. So if you're playing on a current gen console or playing like on a Switch or something like that, this is still a viable option at a lower price point. And last but not least, you got the HD60S Plus. Now this card's been around for a while now, and it's still a great value if you can find it on a used market or even still new through a third-party seller. The limitations on an iPad is it can only go up to 1080p 60 frames per second. Because 4K 60 is limited, this is a 3.0 card. This is like the lowest of USB cards that they offer still. In 4K 60 can't be transferred through there. So your 4K 60 footage, if you have it going in, the pass-through will go fine, but it can only capture at 1080p 60 frames per second. It could capture and pass through 4K 30 frames per second on a computer, but on the iPad, they actually limit this down to 1080p 60 frames per second. You can't get any 4K when it comes to the iPad. So if your iPad is going to be your primary device that you're going to be capturing on, you will definitely hit a limit with this. Now the pass-through will work, but the capture is definitely going to be limited. So you can have a 4K 60 pass-through, right? But you're going to be capturing a 1080 60. So there's definitely a harder limitation with this. But of course, it's also the cheaper of the bunch. And it's also a workhorse. I've had this for how many years now, and it's still going strong. Definitely something to consider. So there's definitely a lot more that can be talked about with the 4K-X, and that's what I'm going to be covering in my next set of videos, especially for someone like me who primarily games and streams and captures on a Mac. I know it's definitely going to be a question that a lot of people are going to want answered. And at the same time, I do have Windows devices to test with, and there's a lot of tests I'm still going through. Capture cards with an iPad are definitely something that you wouldn't have a discussion about like a year ago. It was really unheard of that, actually, yeah, a year ago, you could not capture any webcam capture card on an iPad. It was not even allowed. It wasn't until iOS 17 was released that Apple opened that door for UVC. And since then, there's still few apps on the market that allow you to do such a thing. But the ones that have come to the market have been game-changing, only because you don't have to have a computer to stream anymore. You don't even have to have a computer to edit. You could do everything on an iPad. You could stream on the iPad. You could capture and record on the iPad. You could edit on the iPad. It's kind of insane to think about. And not taking away from these cards are amazing. And the new 4K-X, there's still so much to explore. That's why I said I had to break this out into multiple videos, because we're only tapping the surface of what it can do. Definitely, if you have an iPad, or if you even considered using your iPad to stream or capture stuff, definitely take a look at these cards. Think about what works for your setup. Now, I am recording currently my 4K review, comparing how I use it with my Macs. both a Mac laptop and a desktop. So definitely if you have questions about that, leave it down below. That way I can try to incorporate that while I'm recording that video. Otherwise, if you appreciate this video and you appreciate the knowledge I dropped today, please leave a thumbs up. It helps me know that this is the content you want. It also helps the algorithm and reach other people like you. Otherwise, as always, if you like this content, hit the subscribe button. I appreciate it. You know, I'm trying to get to that monetization so I can make more videos for you. And it'd be nice so that way I wouldn't have to worry about affording all this. I'm just saying, our Elgato, you can reach out. Otherwise, again, I'm Joe. This is Matsu Excel. And as always, I'll catch you guys later. Peace.